Hello. Good afternoon or good evening, everyone. Hopefully, we're watching in all time zones. So wherever you are in the world, good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Welcome to Sankofa Video and Books virtual events. My name is Michaela. I'm the event coordinator here, and we're so happy that you could join us. Happy Black History Month. Tonight we have a very special program. We are joined today by Amazingly Africa, and we're going to watch a short documentary entitled "The African Origin of Civilization: Myth or Reality," and it is based on a book by Sheikh Anta Diop by the same title, which talks about the theory, or as we know it, the fact that civilization did indeed start on the African continent. Immediately following the viewing of that short documentary will be a panel discussion. Okay. And I will let Linda Foinding, the founder of Amazingly Africa, introduce her panelists during that time. So without further ado, I'm going to play the documentary.
It is my deep conviction that the development of the world is due to the contribution of all people. It is fraternal help that will allow Africa to free itself entirely from coercion and exploitation and take to the air. History has taught us that African people's residence in the world was long-lived and their accomplishments illustrious. From the roots of the oldest human beings on the planet to the pinnacle of human excellence, harmony, and balance, the origin of human civilization is African. The cycle that is planting roots in an area to growth and ascension all happened within Africa before spreading to the world. I visited the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston for some field research as it houses one of the biggest collection of African art. This art provides insight on these African societies we hear about so much in an almost mythical and abstract sense. But when seen in person, you understand how tangible these actually are, as they give insight on the type of federal, societal, cultural structures that were in place, as well as a plethora of other things. The descriptions in the museum were often very broad and pretty empty of tangible details relating to us in modern day Africa. So I took it upon myself to tell you my story. What do you say I take you on a short epic full of adventure into the truth of who you truly are? When it comes to classical civilization, nothing comes close to Nile civilization. It's lasted longer than the Greeks and Roman civilizations put together, and it is quintessentially African. Egypt, Nubia, or Sudan, and Ethiopia were constituting the Nile Valley civilizations. Welcome to Amazingly Africa. Let's talk antiquity. Did you know that Africans have the longest history and the longest standing civilization in the world? They invented mathematics, writing, agriculture, astronomy, and circumnavigating the world. Africans were the first to circumnavigate the world and settled in different parts of the world before inventors and navigators like Ferdinand Magellan or Christopher Columbus were even born. Africa has gone by many different names over the centuries. It was once called Ethiopia, Alkebuland, Garden of Eden, and so on and so on. The grand civilizations and empires that existed over the centuries rose and fell like the ebb and flow of ocean waves. From South Africa to North Africa, East Africa to West and Central Africa. The climate over the centuries was ripe with harmony, within creativity, which supported the gradual increase in knowledge through application. From the earliest forms of calculating with the bone of Ishango to the golden ratio that is found in living creatures and art and architectural masterpieces. The evidence is there, but the problem is that we've been so programmed to be anti-African that despite our knowledge on these matters, there's still a tendency to want to reject Africa anyways. Why is that? If growing up you remember watching movies such as Tarzan or King Kong, unconsciously when you think about Africa, you think of a half-naked person with an afro running around with a bone in their nose looking for a Christian missionary for dinner or something. Or today, because of certain NGOs and commercials, when you think about Africa, you think of poverty and famine and disease. But that couldn't be any further from the truth. Movies like these have contributed to the negative mental depictions that we still have of Africa today. Because despite all the things that you learn to counter that, those images are still deeply buried in your psyche. So as we explore Africa the way you have never seen it before, I urge you to keep an open mind and liberate yourself. A particular quote that I admire and love from Sheikh Anta Diop is this: "The history of Black Africa will remain suspended in air and cannot be written correctly until African historians dare to connect it with the history of Egypt." Let us note the astonishment of a scholar of good faith, Count Constantin de Volnay, 1757 to 1820. After being imbued with all the prejudice we have just mentioned with regard to the Negro, Volney had gone to Egypt between 1783 and 1785, while Negro slavery flourished. He reported as follows on the Egyptian race, the very race that produced the pharaohs, the Copts. "When I visited the Sphinx, its appearance gave me the key to the riddle. On seeing that head, typically Negro in all its features, I remembered the remarkable passage from Herodotus, saying, 'As for me, I judged the Colchians to be a colony of the Egyptians because, like them, they are black with woolly hair.' Furthermore," he says, We can even state as a general principle that the face is like a monument, able in many cases to attest or shed light on historical evidence on the origins of people. After illustrating this proposition by citing the case of Normans who still resemble the Danes 900 years after the conquest of Normandy, Volney adds, but returning to Egypt, the lessons she teaches, history contains many reflections for philosophy. Just think that this race of Black men, today our slave and the object of our scorn, is the very race to which we owe our arts, sciences, and even the use of speech. Just imagine, finally, that it is in the midst of peoples who call themselves the greatest friends of liberty and humanity that one has approved the most barbarous slavery and questioned whether Black men have the same kind of intelligence as whites. End of quote. When it comes to classical civilizations, nothing comes close to that of the Nile Valley civilizations. Egypt, Nubia, and Ethiopia, which lasted longer than the Greek and Roman civilizations put together. And it is quintessentially Black African.
The ancient Egyptians themselves said that they came from the south of Kemet, ancient Egypt, which is further up, higher up the Nile Valley, closer to the source. And they identified the mountains of the moon, which are in modern-day Uganda, as their place of origin.
Most historians now accept, even the European Eurocentric ones, that it is the movement of the peoples from the south to the north that gave birth to Kemet. However, what they fail to recognize that is not just the movement of these one set of Africans traveling from the south to the north, but also movements of other Africans coming from the west to the east. They met and collected together in what is now Kemet. That's why that civilization was so powerful, because it was a multicultural expression of the African experience. It was several sets of different Africans coming together in one place and creating a civilization.
All of these people are connected to each other, and dividing them in a way that implies a level of discreteness that the term race implies is inappropriate. Were there people with darker skin, lighter skin, curlier hair, less curly hair? Yes, there were. There's no evidence that the ancient Egyptians who did medicine, who made observations, and sometimes detailed artwork about the environment around them, animals, plants, there's no evidence that they had a theory of human variation that would be commensurate or similar to notions of race as they were developed in Europe. There's a deep shared ancestry in the Sahara of these societies. The fact that they were sometimes in conflict, we should not impose our reasons, our ways of thinking onto why this conflict may have occurred. The conflicts were political, social, probably over the same issues. Let's not read ideas about the reason of this conflict back into the past. We have to avoid stereotypes. We have to avoid the old ways of thinking, but just put into new data sets or new types of data, which I do believe that we can see in literature sometimes today, you know. And I think that a lot of times, if you look very carefully at the scientific literature, you'll see that sometimes the old ways of thinking are lurking beneath the surface there. And this is something that needs to be addressed.
Most people think of ancient Nubia as a poor imitation and perpetual vassal of pharaonic Egypt. But archaeological discoveries in recent decades have proved them wrong, incrementally revealing magnificent kingdoms. The show at the MFA in Boston, titled Ancient Nubia Now, aimed to redress the balance a little bit further, as it should. since the MFA to some degree helped create that initial impression based on its foundational series of digs with Harvard University between 1913 and 1932, led by George Andrew Reisner of Harvard. To this day, those finds constitute the greatest collection of Nubian artifacts outside of Sudan, the African nation whose Upper Nile region incorporates Nubia of old. 25,000 pieces in their vaults. Unfortunately, what it doesn't attempt to do is tell ancient Nubia's full story from its earliest beginnings, which predates ancient Egypt or Kemet and goes back circa 5,000 years and beyond, as demonstrated by early rock paintings. Nor does it address that Nubia ushered Africa's first Iron Age. You see, in some aspects, the Africa I live in today in the 21st century is different from the one depicted in these bronze and copper, gold, ivory, and ebony and granite statues, monuments, and artifacts. But it's also the same in many ways. You see, Africa, like every other society in the world, was involved in this evolutionary process. Family, tribe, nation, and continent. This evolutionary process leads to unity. And the African evolutionary process was intercepted in two forms by Europeans. The first was slavery, and the second, colonialism. Over 300 million of the strongest outside of Africa. And then they divided Africa during the Berlin Conference. You know, our current political borders were drawn up and our land was stolen from under us with disregard for groups of peoples, cultures, and without our consent. Today, it's ironic that almost all African countries are described as young because of their recent independence in the 1950s, while simultaneously holding the position of having the longest history of a people on the planet. As you know, because of racism, Africa is belittled everywhere. And because of that, we do not see its constant contribution to world civilizations. Ancient Africans had developed several tools and resources that we use every day, like papyrus, which was the first form of paper. They had also developed several writing systems over the centuries in different parts of Africa, such as the hieroglyphics, which is actually called Meduniter, Ethiopic script, Coptic, which later became Greek, and Nsibidi. Nsibidi is said to be one of the oldest writing systems in Africa, and it originates in modern-day Cameroon and Nigeria. The characters and symbols were a reflection of societal, legal, intimate, and spiritual matters. Just as is seen in many African cultures, the symbols were immersed in buildings, homes, artifacts, and specific textiles. Not unlike ancient Kemet or Egypt, only the members, in this case only members of the leopard society of the Ijangam people, were privy to meanings behind those CBD symbols, as they hold spiritual significance. Gaining access to this knowledge was the equivalent of winning a Nobel Peace Prize in our modern-day society, so it was a privilege. This African math and science writing led to medicine, geometry, architecture, art, astrology, navigation, irrigation, agriculture. Many of our ancestors sought to keep this knowledge alive through the millennia by literally weaving the information into their clothes. Many fabrics we see worn today in the form of Belgian wax and others from China have nothing to do with what we are dealing with here. This beautiful deep blue color is made from global indigo leaves and is found in Nigeria as well as Cameroon. It's called do in Cameroon in the Cameroon regions. The process of weaving together textiles took many forms, using raffia trees, Egyptian papyrus, and even native cotton. The textiles were then painstakingly drawn on the fabrics by masters and later dyed in various shades of indigo and brown. And this process incorporated the collaboration of various communities from north, south, east, west of different nations and through dynasties. The Ukura cloth in Nigeria, for example, is very similar to the Ndop and Togo cloth in Cameroon. This goes to show that the current political constraints and borders we have today do not dictate who we are. They say that imitation is the highest form of flattery. Africa continues to inspire but also be imitated today. These writing symbols can be seen in modern-day pop culture, from the Adinkra symbols used on the Target logo to the fashion label designers such as Versace, Louis Vuitton, and so on. It is also said that many of the works of many Europeans, such as Picasso, were highly influenced by African art and the Cubism movement. It's very flattering to be imitated, of being seen as an example to follow. But do not hold your breath in expectation of gratitude, because as this art was being copied, its people were being looted, put in shackles, and decades of propaganda were proliferated in order to prove the inferiority of Africans. A young man named Basquiat turned the tables by reappropriating and remastering what was his birthright. In many of his paintings, we find CBD pictograms, and many other Africans are using various African writing systems and adapting them to their current and future prerogatives, like fashion, art, calligraphy, graphic design, and film. You're probably asking yourself, why Africa? Why amazingly Africa? Why Black Africa? Why? And my answer is simple. My focus will always be what and how I know how to be, and that is African. The African evolutionary process was interrupted by European capitalists. Had Africa been left untrapped, we would have already seen continental unity. African problems will be defended and tackled by Africans and Afro-descendants without compromise. And if I am called fanatical or racist for looking at African solutions to African problems, that is not my vocabulary, as I will never compromise my integrity or apologize for being African, because Africa is who I am, who I was, and who I will always be. I am proud of my heritage, and I want others to see Africa for what it truly is, for its beauty, for its wonderful contributions to the world, for its love, and for all of the things that it has been denied over the centuries. So I urge you to use African history to create your reality instead of looking to others. Like I always say, know thyself to empower thyself. My name is Linda Foinding, and you're listening to Emoja Sessions.
Wow, wasn't that powerful? I hope you all enjoyed that as much as I did. And if you learned anything new, if you want to comment anything, please put it in the chat. Don't forget that there will be a short Q&A session after this panel discussion. And without further ado, I'm going to bring our panelists on. And well, before I do that, let me just tell you who you will be speaking with. This will be Atlantis Browder, Kamau Grimes, Mouse Henderson, and of course, amazingly Africa founder and host of the podcast, Linda Foinding. Here we are. Greetings, everyone. Can you hear me?
Hi, Michaela. We can hear you.
Sound awesome. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to you, Linda.
Awesome. So I do want to introduce the panel. And first of all, thank you all for joining us online right now. Make sure to send in your questions, comments as we go along with the panel discussion. First off, to my right, I'll be introducing Atlantis Browder. She is the co-author of 3 books. My First Trip to Africa, which was published in 1991 when she was only 8 years old. Africa on My Mind, which was published in 1995. And Reflections of My First Trip to Africa, which was published in 2020. Her books are currently used in classrooms in the US and around the world. She has been to 25 states throughout the US and has visited over 15 countries. She graduated from Bowie State University, where she received a bachelor's degree in history and government. Between 2001 and 2019, Atlantis worked with Children's Defense Fund Freedom Program and has trained thousands of elementary school, high school, and college students around the country in areas of reading, enrichment, curriculum delivery, team building, leadership development, and social action. Atlantis has worked as an educator in the District of Columbia since 2007 and is currently serving as the National Director for IKG Cultural Imperative Program, which allowed her to reach a larger number of youth around the United States. Atlantis is the Vice President of the IKG Cultural Center in Washington, D.C., and has spent every summer since 2010 working with her father, excavating and restoring the 25th dynasty tomb of Karakamun. Did I say that correctly? Awesome. On the west bank of Luxor, Egypt. Since 2011, Atlantis has served as the Assistant Archaeological Mission Director, in which she supervises project volunteers and manages the mission residents. This historical work is done under the supervision of the ASA Restoration Project, which is the first Egyptian excavation funded by African Americans. All right. So Miles Henderson, all the way till the end. Miles is an African-focused entrepreneur, academically trained in foreign affairs while pursuing technical-based ventures towards the unity of Black people globally, as showcased through the mobile app Portal. He's the founder of TCU True Culture University, a Pan-African collegiate platform with student chapters all over the world. He has been an active Pan-Africanist and student of Marcus Garvey from the inception of his career. He's a member of the Marcus Garvey Bronze Coordinating Committee project aiming to create a statue of Marcus Garvey at the African Union HQ. He's currently living between the US and Ethiopia. All right, and next up, and last but not least, is Kamau Grimes. Kamau is a native Washingtonian and graduate of Morehouse College and Howard University. He earned his master's degree in American Studies and Research in 2009, African Studies, pardon me, where he focused on Ethiopian and African American relations, becoming proficient in the Arabic language. Over the last decade, he has traveled to Ghana, Togo, Ethiopia, Egypt, and elsewhere in search of recovering and sharing African history. He's currently an educator working in the African-centered school system, as well as a team member at Sankofa Video and Bookstore, our generous hosts today. All right. So we have a jam-packed panel of experts to talk about this amazing documentary. And so the first thing that I want to do is start with history, because as you know, history is the fundamental. And as we go throughout this conversation, I want you guys to ask questions live streamed. And I also have loads of questions for my panelists, but we probably will not address all of them. Hopefully we will address some. All right, so the first question or the comment I would say is, fundamentally, we say that Africa is the birthplace of humanity and civilization. Can we validate and justify that expression? We were the first, but what did we really do, right? Why do we talk about Egypt? Why do we talk about Kemet so much? Why do we have to start in Africa? Anybody can take it, but I think Atlantis, I want you to start it.
Sure. So it is in Africa where we have found the oldest evidence of human remains. So science has proven that, archaeology has helped us come to that reality. And so, it's straightforward, right? And so what did we do? And I'll just highlight that briefly and then pass it on. But we are the mothers and fathers of civilization. So when we're talking about civilization, just the social and cultural development, advanced development, so mathematics, science, architecture, spirituality, astrology, and the more you begin to do research, not of just African history and culture, but other cultures around the world, you realize that Africa, and particularly Nile Valley culture and civilization, is the inspiration for many of those things.
Yes, and I just want to follow up and say that I would be remiss if I didn't say one of the quotes from a local DC elder, but an international elder, Baba Oduno, where he says, "There is no culture without agriculture." And those who are familiar with Sankofa and DC, they know that saying. But what does that really mean? Agriculture sets the stage so that you can have a settled lifestyle, and such that you're not living a nomadic lifestyle, following your food from here to there. You can actually settle, and it's in that settlement that you're actually able to devise more of those advanced technologies, advanced artwork, and music, and some of those science, those things that make life worth living, that take you from just the standpoint of survival to thriving. And I just wanted to touch briefly, I am a social studies teacher, and when you look at most curriculums, they start civilization with Mesopotamia. So some people, for those who don't know, Mesopotamia is a civilization that emerged on the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what's modern known as Iraq and Kuwait today. And these two rivers are also mentioned in the Bible. There's a lot of, it's interesting though, when you look at the dates that they use for the civilizations, they're about the same dates that they use for the Nile Valley civilizations, but they tend to take it like 100 or 200 years earlier. But when you really look into that, it's a bit disingenuous, because Mesopotamia, they never developed a nation state. It was just city states. I mean, they had a code of law, they had different things, but around 3,200 BC or about earlier, that's when that civilization started to emerge. But pre-dynastic Kemet goes before 3,200 BC. So they try to start Kemet with 3,200 BC, but the civilization already existed. It's just that upper Kemet and lower Kemet came together to form a nation state in 3,200 BC. So the calendar is at least 4,200 BC, and the civilization is there. So you got to be interested. It's interesting. I've seen people, this is the last thing I'll say, but I've seen presentations or documentaries, educational resources, where they say Mesopotamia was the first civilization. Oh, and the Nile Valley started up around the same time too. So it's interesting how they'll say it's the first, but then at the same time they'll say Nile Valley was around the same time, but we know that it's even older. As you alluded to in the video, Kemet's not the first; it was Nubia as well.
Exactly. And so that my next question following up on that is, if Kemet and all these ancient African empires and dynasties were so grand, why did they fall? How did they fail? What really happened? So I'll first start off by saying that personally, Kemet, we know that there were several invasions, right? There were the Persians, the Hyksos, the Greeks, and then the Romans. And all these invasions successively did not happen, immediately, right? They happened over hundreds of years, thousands of years. And they usually started with internal conflict, when internal kingdoms, internal dynasties were warring, right? Where brothers and sisters were at odds between one another. But can you guys take that a little bit further?
Well, I think I'll just start with the basic reality that every civilization that rises is going to come to an end. no nation is immune to that process. And so it's a matter of how long the civilizations can maintain their culture and other things that have helped to keep that civilization going. And it is my belief and understanding that part of the reason we were able to do that in the Nile Valley is because we were rooted in spirituality and cultural practice that helped us sustain it for thousands of years.
Okay.
Definitely. And kind of just to go on to that, I think a lot of times when we're talking about the Nile River Valley, we don't really appreciate the timeline that we're dealing with. We're dealing with an extremely long timeline. And I know we're talking about, 3,000, 4,000 BC, but really the evolution of humankind predates that even, most likely in the hundreds of thousands of years, even when you're looking at the genetic material that's found there. So I'm saying all this to say that when you're dealing with timelines this long, of course, there will be ebbs and flows that go up and down. When you're dealing with literally the creators of the entire foundation of the human experience, Chekan Diop talks about the first people to actually create social structure for human beings and humankind and the actual evolution of consciousness. All of these things are the building blocks for the entire human experience. So if this is the case in the timeline we're dealing with, of course, there'll be ups and downs with that.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on the fact of, yes, definitely the internal turmoil is what caused it. And when you have internal turmoil, you become an easy target for outsiders. So, like you mentioned, the Hyksos. The Hyksos, they were the first to invade. Kemet had different intermediate periods before they would finally got taken away by the other civilizations. So the Hyksos, they came in a long time, around at least 1700 BC. But then eventually, after a few hundred years, they were kicked out, you know, and then there was other times of internal turmoil where it wasn't necessarily outside invasion, but the culture was not progressing. There weren't the innovation had started to die. So, and then you see that there's periods of revival, like the 25th dynasty, which is the dynasty of the Nubian dynasty, which some actually could view as an invasion because it wasn't ruled by Kemites in a sense, but it was ruled by, the Kushites that came up from the south, and then the Assyrians took it from the Kushites. So, but when the Kushites came, they revived a lot of that culture because there was that Nile Valley continuum. But once you started to see some of the other cultures coming in, that's where you start to see a devolution in the culture and in our practices, especially with the Romans.
And and the Romans and the Greek civilizations, as grand as they were, they also fell, right? So it just shows that civilizations rise and fall. But you mentioned I mentioned the Hyksos and the Persians as well. It's funny that when the Hyksos were first kicked out, the next ruler that came up was Hatshepsut, right? And she was a female ruler. And when the Persians came in with Ashurbanipal, the last ruler was, I think, Shepenupet II, and that was a female ruler as well. And that brings me to my next comment. What was the role of women in those ancient civilizations? Because when we hear about queens, an African queen was not an African queen because she was married to a king. She was an African queen because she was ruling side by side with a king. So let's talk a little bit more about that. And, I know that the royal line in a lot of ancient kingdoms were matrilineal versus the patrilineal system that we have today.
Well, I wouldn't. I'm not an expert in this realm, but from my understanding, you do have the concept of the queen mother. Well, you see it in Ghana. You also will see it in the Nile Valley, where, it's just like you said, their children are going to be ascend to the royal throne, especially their sons will be the king. So it's not like the father doesn't pass it on to his son. The mother, it has to come, if the mother is of a royal line, then her son can rule. So, you do see Hatshepsut, you see You see other strong queens like Queen T, even though she wasn't necessarily a pharaoh, she definitely ruled as a co-regent and dealt with a lot of affairs. I think that there was still, from my understanding in the classes and things that I've studied, there was still some discrimination and patriarchy there. However, there was a lot more room, a lot more social room for women to flourish, especially in terms of like economics, in terms of running the markets and managing the household economy. So I think that but what you see very clearly though is the spiritual system. Is that within the Kemetic spiritual system, they always had a god and a goddess, and there's always seeking for that balance between masculine and feminine. So I think that's probably one of the strongest that you see. And then later on, you do see the what's known as the Candaces that come up from the queens of Nubia.
Kandakes.
Yeah,
in Nubia.
I don't think they're known as the Candaces, but technically it's Kandake. Yeah, but they went toe to toe with the Roman Empire and they defended themselves and their sovereignty. So you have a long history of queens in the Nile Valley who, they didn't base their legitimacy off of anything to do with the man.
Okay.
And I will just to add to that, you showed an image in your film where it's a statue of a ruler and his wife. And so what you often see when you're traveling to Kemet is the woman is not behind or in front, he's beside, and you often see her hand holding up the spine or the back of the male. So it's almost symbolically representing that nurturing and supportive energy that we provide to the king.
Oh, awesome. I love that.
Can I add something as well?
Yes.
When we're talking about, the aspect of rulership moving from one individual to the next, one of the things when it does go through the female line is because that's the genetic material that you're taking with yourself, so you get your genetic material from your mother, and so if you're going to be considering something that should be considered, was kind of, I think, the framework. And I also wanted to mention the two cradle theory by Cheikhan Diop as well. And essentially he talks about, the difference between Nile River Valley civilizations as well as those, I think he was contrasting between Greece and Rome at the time and saying how there was an enslavement of women in those societies because of a lack of resources, as opposed to the abundance of resources you found in the Nile River Valley, which allowed for an upliftment of women. And I lived in Ethiopia for this last year, and something that I found very interesting when considering Nile River Valley is that even within the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, there's a huge upliftment of the Virgin Mary, which is very much in a sense an upliftment still of women and kind of the whole queendom that you're kind of showcasing in the question. So that is something that is still very much relevant now.
And it's interesting that you mentioned Virgin Mary, because that story of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, or the idea of the Trinity is inspired by Kemetic spirituality, one of the oldest myths that exists today, the story of Asar, Set, and Heru. And not to go into too much detail about that story, I would encourage our viewers to Google it and do some more reading to learn more. But the essence of that story is that the ruler Asar had a beautiful wife, Set, and he respected her to the point that whenever he traveled and had to leave the country, he would leave his wife in charge. And so what's interesting is that within that story, Asar's brother, Set, was jealous that his brother didn't share that same power with him, and instead allowed his wife to have that experience. And as a result of that jealousy, Set ended up killing his brother Asar. So whether it's the Christian version or the Kemetic version, like you said, we see this continuity in terms of the female energy and women being raised and symbolically representing that spiritual aspect of our existence.
Absolutely.
Awesome. And I would say to the viewers who want to learn more about it, Asar, Aset, and Heru are most commonly known as Osiris, Isis, and Horus. And this actually takes us to the next point that I want to talk about, which is terms, right, and names. So many of the terms that we use to describe African people, places, and things are actually European terms, right? And I want to talk about the psychological effect of changing a name. For example, when Greece conquered Egypt in 332 BC, they named it, when they conquered Kemet, they named it Egypt, right? And then there's, the name Egypt, there's the name pyramid, there's the name Sphinx. Those are all Greek terms to describe African places, people, things, right? So what does that mean? What happens when something is changed in that way?
Well, you've disconnected it from its source, and you're going through a middleman. You're not going directly to the source for the information. And it's essentially like you're listening to what someone else has to say about someone versus what they have to say about themselves. So we're constantly viewing Africa through the lens of what outsiders have to say about Africa. And unfortunately, we as Africans many of us have learned our history from what Europeans have, documented, and that's the basis of our understanding of reality. So, I mean, it can't be underestimated. Example would be Sphinx. The Kemetic term is Harem Akhet, which translates to Haru on the horizon. Now I'm showing what I've learned from her father, but Haru on the horizon, and but the Sphinx, and we just talked about Haru, but so in the Kemetic sense, it's representing the mind of man, conquering just the animal pleasures, the animal urges and things like that. Those animalistic instincts, but it's actually elevating to the higher mind of man, which is connecting to the divine.
Hence the head of a
human on the body of an animal. But when you look in the Sphinx, there's a whole background and story about the Sphinx, where there's the riddle of the Sphinx in the Greek, mythology, where you have to get the riddle right, or you get eaten or something like that. Strangled, something, you destroyed. So it's the Sphinx is kind of like a monster in a way.
In
Greek mythology. So just because both of them are lying with a human head with a lion body doesn't mean they represent the same thing. And so, just even in that is one example how you see that the meaning is lost. I mean, Kemet means it means the black land or the land of the blacks. That's fiercely debated. We don't get into that. But when you look at Egypt, I mean, it's a derivation of another word, Hiku or Hitka Ptah, the land of the god Ptah. But once it becomes Egypt, it almost like loses its significance, its meaning. We don't even know, Egypt, that references to Ptah, or who is Ptah. But now that the Ptah is taken out of it, now that it's just something totally different, that connection is lost.
Yeah. Did you want to say something?
Go ahead.
No. So, I mean, I think what Kamau said is really important in terms of the cultural lens, because just as you explained, the difference between Harem Akhet and the Sphinx, which if you actually Google an image of a Sphinx, it's actually an image of a woman, an entity with breasts and wings, and it's very different from Harem Akhet. But even something as simple as the pyramid, that's a Greek word which essentially means little flat cake. And many of the pyramids that the Greeks discovered when they came into Egypt, many of them had been destroyed. But if we look at it through the proper cultural lens, the correct name for a pyramid is Mir, right?
I learned that from your dad.
Which means place of ascension. So many people often believe that kings and queens were buried inside of the tomb, and that's far from the truth. There have never been any bodies discovered inside of the tomb. They were buried underneath the pyramids, and the pyramids were built over top. So whether they serve as a grave marker, but more so, sorry, losing my train of thought. It's a place. A mirror is a place of ascension. So it is the vehicle through which the spirit can transcend and go to heaven, metaphorically speaking.
Okay.
Can I add something as well? The way I had interpreted the question, I was thinking of like my own name.
Yes.
In terms of like, so my background is African American, so of course I have a westernized name, a Europeanized name, and one of the things that Chancellor Williams, he talked about. He's like, you can kind of determine where the conquest is of a people based on the names they have, whether they're in the context he was talking about was Arabized or Westernized. And so I think even the names we treat ourselves with can kind of determine, or not necessarily determine, but showcase where exactly we are at with our frame of reality. And just, some of the names that we may engage with on the continent of Africa, when people tell you their name meanings, it may mean the throne of the Lord, or it may mean something that has deep meaning and value. But when it just comes back and now your name is all of a sudden, just, not to take away, knock anyone's name, just Joe or something. You know what I mean? So there's something to be said for that as well.
And Miles, you made a really valid point, because I was thinking about that concept earlier today, and it reminded me of the fact that in many West African cultures, they have a ritual or a ceremony in which the mother, before she even gives birth to the child, the priest or priestesses or spiritual leaders of the community, they have a ceremony where they communicate with the spirit of the child while he or she is still in the mother's womb. And they, from that spirit realm or ancestral realm, they are receiving information from that child, from that spirit, in order to know what its purpose was. What did you come to this plane to do in this lifetime? And based on that information, they give the child a name that will represent its purpose. So going back to what you said, when we think of Africans, even though, I'm sure as a child, many people would make fun of African names because they were long and we couldn't pronounce it, with our tongue. But it just reminds us of the importance of names. And when we think about African Americans, we are the only people on this earth who have gone through so many name changes in an effort to identify or connect with who we are. So going from Negro to colored to African American, and now most of our folks feel comfortable using the N-word. But I think that truly demonstrates the power of names, right? But also why so many of our people have decided to take on an African name, because it gives them purpose or gives them some type of spiritual or cultural grounding, which unfortunately so many of our people are missing, even on the continent.
Wow, that's really deep. And I want to say something really quickly to the audience. We're not saying that you guys should change your name if you're named Joe. But we are saying that it's not really about I think it's not really about what you're named, but it's also about what you do with that knowledge once you know it, right? Marcus Garvey never changed his name, and he never wore, African clothes, but we see the implications of all the amazing things that he's done for Afro descendants around the world. So I hope you get the message behind what we've been talking about with names. And so I want to bring up something, which is we're going to move on a little bit from history, and we're going to move on to more geopolitical and current events. But before we do that, I want to talk about the importance of timelines, right? And how does a timeline play in hiding the reality of people and who they are, right? So, for example, the Greeks borrowed many, many things from Africa, right? And they didn't always acknowledge it. And so when you look at the timeline, the Greeks and the Roman civilization started about 856 BC for Greece and 730 for Rome. But we mentioned earlier that Kemet started about 4000 BC and beyond, most likely, right? And so that means that ancient Kemet preceded the Greek and Roman civilizations by about 2,000 years. That's 2,000 years of knowledge, 2,000 years of trial and error, 2,000 years of success and failures, 2,000 years of births, of charting the stars, right? And also the Arabs came in at 648 AD, around that time. So when I say that the Greeks borrowed stuff from Africa and didn't always acknowledge it, there's this quote from Homer. We were talking about Greek mythology earlier, and he says that the gods and goddesses of Greece came out of Africa, which was came out of Ethiopia, which was what they called Africa at the time. And they had to go back to Africa once a year to renew their powers, lest they become mortal. So one more example before I ask the question is Kemet, for example, ancient Egypt, they use what we call the Pythagorean theorem, right, to build the pyramids. How many 2,000 years before Pythagoras actually quote unquote discovered it, right? So can you guys tell us a little bit about the importance of a timeline, right? Like what does it mean to know your history, to know your timeline in terms of all these things that I just listed?
Well, I think on a very basic level, using timelines gives historical context. Oftentimes, when I do presentations, particularly with young people, I find that they are so surprised to learn that the ancient Egyptians are African, look just like us, right? And of course, we know that many of them, many people have been miseducated. But when we think about the images that are portrayed of what the Egyptian people look like, whether it's the Mummy, and other movies that focus on Egyptian history and culture, they present those personalities as non-African, right? And so when we use the timeline, and whether you start from, when the Arabs come in, but trace your way back, what we find is that when most people are talking about ancient Kemetic history, they're starting at the point in which the Greeks and Romans came in. And if they do go beyond that point, they don't necessarily touch on the racial component. But even just outside of just a regular timeline with numbers and words, even using images is so powerful. That's why I really like your video, because the visuals and images are so powerful, especially working with young people, and particularly as it relates to Kemetic history. If you take 1,000 years worth of Kemetic rulers and you look at the statues and the images, the facial characteristics, the features are clearly African. And then when the Greeks and Romans and other foreigners come in, they are creating images in their likeness. And so referencing a pictorial timeline, it becomes clear when Kemet became Egypt, or the point in which the foreigners came in and began to change things.
Yeah, that was a great question. Timelines are critical, pivotal, foundational. Chronology is becoming a lost art. People have no concept of time and space, especially, young people, adults, a lot of us, we don't know. People think that the Hebrews built the pyramids. They think that the Hebrews were enslaved and built the pyramids, but if you actually understand, okay, pyramids of Giza were made in around 2,500 BC. Abraham is said to have been born in 1700 BC. This isn't even, the Hebrew people are not even a people. They're not even a fully formed people yet. Moses, the dates that they give for Moses is around 1350, 1300 BC. So that's like
1,200.
Over 1,000 years, after the pyramids were created. So, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because they follow us on TV.
Yeah.
I can tell you that it's the same. Let me not go on the sideline. But the thing is, those images are so strong, and our lack of understanding of chronology is so weak that we don't even know. I asked. Well, I don't want to put some of my students out there, but people think that things that happen in the 60s happen in the 20s, or they don't know. The chronology and the timeline is so important because I'll leave it at this. If you start your history with slavery, everything else looks like an improvement. History is not the beginning of Black history. Slavery is not the beginning of Black history. It interrupted Black history. And so when you really look at a timeline, you gotta look at it like, I love being a social studies teacher, and I love prehistory. Why is prehistory? Because it's before the written record.
Who's written record?
Yeah, exactly. Well, before the written records that we found. Prehistory is kind of looked at. When you get to a point where you don't have writing to substantiate anything, you have to look at artifacts and start to do archaeology. Prehistory, it gets into the realm of where science helps us to fill in the gaps of what just the typical history modalities of reading text or oral tradition, but they can't do. So you have to. It gets to a certain point in history where you have to dig things up under the ground to find out what happened, or you have to test the DNA to find out, what happened, because none of us were there. But when you think about this stuff, the modern Homo sapiens, that is, us right now, have been around at least 200,000 years. And so we typically start history, around maybe 10,000 years or less, but really 6,000. History is kind of trapped into this 6,000 year prison. That's why Mesopotamia and Egypt, Mesopotamia and these different civilizations, you don't really hear too much of things going on before like 4,000 BC. But we know that human beings have been here for since 200,000 BC. So that's 196,000 years of human history that's not even touched on. And we know that the timeline is so important. Africans never left Africa until about 70,000 or 60,000 BC. And then we didn't go through the evolutionary changes or mutations to become into the different phenotypes until much later. You had a 10,000 year ice age that created these other phenotypes. And so when you actually look at science, and you guys can do your research, some of the genes for having non-melanated skin are only, some say they're only about possibly 8,000 years old. And so you guys can look some of those things up. And so we don't know what's going on. That's all I'm saying.
well, let me add to that, because I think you made an important point about the dates and the tens of thousands of years in between. But there is an exhibit at the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, the Coke exhibit. But they talk about the evolution of man, and one of the things, actually 3 important takeaways that they make very clear in that exhibit is that, number one, humanity started in Africa, and at least 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens were the only beings in Africa. And then about 60,000 years ago, Africans left the continent and migrated into Asia. And then 40,000 years ago, Africans migrated out of the continent into Europe. And so it's kind of interesting when we look at that timeline, because the people who have, the Africans that evolved into Europeans, right? They have been on the planet the shortest amount of time, but yet they have been able to dominate almost every aspect of humanity. So that's, and so you can go to the museum and see this 20.5
museum,
$20.5 million exhibit. That was opened in 2010, and that was the result of over 150 researchers, educators, doing the work to bring this information to the forefront. So it's in that exhibit, and anybody can go and visit that and see for themselves.
Can I just say one last thing on timeline?
Yes.
5.8 million years ago, they found Ardipithecus, which is it's a mix. If you really, in terms of evolution, it's one of the oldest, pretty much like the oldest, one of our oldest ancestors.
Pre-Homo sapiens.
Yeah, this is pre-Homo sapiens. So even you have, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, all of the different, the Homo, that's where it becomes into, the humans. But Australopithecus is still the ape, the ape man. So, how far do you really want to go? We can keep taking it back further, and it's just going to still be in Africa. But it's just 5.8 million years versus 8,000 years.
Okay, so that goes to show that what are we trying to say? That written record began in Africa, and humanity started in Africa, which means that the oldest documented cultural civilization that we know of today started in Africa. And I think it's important to understand that we're saying all of this because we're saying that Western culture dominates the world, right? But Western culture their foundation is built on Greek and Roman culture, whose culture is built, their foundation is built on African culture. Okay, so we're trying to tell the audience to use empirical evidence, right, to build on a foundation of knowledge and not think about it as a thing of power or supremacy or racism, but more of a scientifical and methodological way of thinking about these things. Okay, so we're going to move on really quickly from history because we don't want this to be too long. And we're going to go into geopolitical topics. So we're going to talk about the disastrous effects of the aftermath of slavery, colonialism, and the whitewashing of history that we've talked about in so far. I know when I was talking to you, Atlantis, you mentioned this quote: "An event doesn't end at the end of its occurrence; it continues for generations." So can we talk a little bit about that in terms of why we see, for example, Africans and African Americans clashing, and Black people around the world denying Africa, right? And so what does that mean? What does that say about that whitewashing, to say that after so many years, it's still happening? There's still the skin bleaching, right? There's still the wanting to be more French than the French, the wanting to be more European than the Europeans, like the Chancellor William mentions in this book, The Destruction of Black Civilization.
Well, that quote that I shared with you was by Amos Wilson, and I think it's kind of plain and simple. One of the realities that we're facing is that even though slavery has been over for a couple of hundred of years, it still impacts us to this day, and not just African Americans, but every person of African ancestry, or people in the diaspora. So on the continent, we're looking at colonialism and slavery on the continent and how that impacted them. And I think the root of the issue, or at least part of the root of the issue, what you spoke to, is this idea or belief in white supremacy, that white people, white things, white culture, white anything, or European is superior to African history and culture. And so again, that's a part of the miseducation. And so wherever conquerors go, they take their language, history, and culture, and they force it upon the people that they are conquering. So even kind of, not to backtrack too much, but when we talked about the importance of names, Dr. John Henrik Clarke taught us that the name that a people call themselves should connect them with the landmass, a history, and a culture, right? Mm-hmm. And so many of our people are even some ethnic groups in Northern Africa who don't even consider themselves African, mm-hmm. because of the negative connotations associated with the quote unquote dark continent, right? But again, mm-hmm. it's all a process of miseducation. And I think that's why this conversation is important, because even though, we could probably go on for hours about, all of the information, not all of the information, but important pieces of information that will help us to kind of put the puzzle pieces together and just kind of lead us in the right direction in terms of where we begin to start, because there's so many places we can begin to start, but I think it is important that we start with educating ourselves. And so that means that we have to read. Unfortunately, a lot of our people don't want to read. And why is that? Because even on a very subconscious level, we've been trained to taught not to read. It's almost like it's in our DNA. There's something called ancestral DNA. And so the experiences that our ancestors went through, good or bad, that has been passed down through our bloodline. And so when there was we're talking about a period in history in which it was literally illegal for mm-hmm. African people to read and write. They would have their fingers or hands cut off, their eyes gouged out. And so when we think about the terror and trauma that's almost ingrained in our DNA because of those experiences, that has been passed down to young people. And unfortunately, because we don't necessarily live in a society or have the best educational system, which pushes them to do the things that they need to do, we're lagging behind mm-hmm. Compared to so many other countries.
Can I jump in
yeah.
here? I would say kind of the whole notion of I think it was named concurrence. You said concurrence of generations. Mm-hmm. In simple terms, the game is still being played, so the game is not over. And I think that there's an attitude amongst many of us that what has happened, and there's really no more to come, and there's really no more changing that. But the case actually stands. The reason why we are dealing with all of these different issues is because we are still dealing with the various realms of power that have been imposed upon us. So our social power, economic power, political power, and military power has all been handicapped. So all of these things that we need to engage in as a people are actively being oppressed because, all right, so if we're playing the game of global domination, if you have a people that you have restricted, it's within everybody's interest on the planet to keep them restricted because that's one less player to deal with. So the game is essentially we have to re-engage with our power creation capabilities so that we are actually playing and we aren't completely taken out of the game. And when I say game, it is the global political game. So look at, this is a sad example, but it's a realistic one. Look at the Native American populations that were completely wiped out. That was a geopolitical circumstance that has affected them to where now playing the game is almost not even within their capacity.
Yeah.
We still have access to a continent. We still have access to a huge population. And we still have access now to an upward trajectory that I think all of us are seeing. And it's just going to require our own engagement to kind of realize that what has occurred does not mean that is what it has to be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we need to go off what he's saying. We need a victorious mindset and not a victim mindset. Even though we've been victimized, we don't need to continue to victimize ourselves. We can hold others responsible for the evil things that they've done to us, but we have to hold ourselves responsible for creating our reality. And so many of us are resigned to, well, they're not going to do this for me, or they're not going to do that for me. Well, why should they? Why should anyone do anything for you? You should do something for yourself. We have to do what we can for ourselves. Even if you have the moral high ground and say, this is what I'm owed, well, what are you going to do when they don't give it to you? You still have to move on with your life. You still have to build and provide for your family. So that's why we have to continue to stay in the game.
Yeah.
Stay hopeful. And I wouldn't play too much into turmoil between Africans and African Americans. I know it exists, but I think it's so much easier for us to pay attention to negatives. Just even the way a human mind works, because it's a survival mechanism. We're geared towards noticing when there's something wrong because that can help us to stay away from danger and to preserve our life.
Yeah.
And so, controversy sells, and so those conflicts are going to be amplified. But look at what we're doing today, and there's I've been in many spaces where you have great relationships between Africans and African Americans, but
like right now.
yeah, but they're not highlighted in the same way because people like to have a conflict narrative.
And I think we also have to be honest that it's probably not the intention of those who are in power to ensure that we can make those connections.
Can I add?
Hi guys. Sorry, I know this conversation is getting real deep, and
do we have any questions from the audience?
Exactly. Speaking of highlighting, I'm going to highlight some of those questions. We have a couple. The first one I'm going to read to you all is from Centoyan Lambda. Antonio, do you understand that? Oh wait, they're referring to someone else. Let me go to Antonio's. Many origin stories stem from present-day Ethiopia, but what do other geographic areas of the continent are of interest? What other areas are of interest? What do present-day Tanzania, Namibia, Ghana offer us to find answers? And that question is for anyone on the panel.
Can I question that?
Go ahead. Well, specifically, we know Ethiopia, but when we're dealing with Nile Valley civilization, we have to deal with the entire Nile Valley, not just the Nile River proper, but the White Nile and the Blue Nile.
And so the source of the Nile.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. The White Nile and the Blue Nile; those are the sources of the Nile. The White Nile is coming from Lake, what they call Lake Victoria, which the local people call Nyanza. And so that lake touches Uganda, Congo, Tanzania, and others. And that's the area what's known as the Mountains of the Moon, where the ancient Egyptians say they come from. So that's that in terms of when dealing with Nile Valley civilization, you're dealing with numerous countries more than just Egypt. So that's one. And in terms of Ghana, I mean, you see Ghana had the year of return, 2 years ago. Ghana Ghana is pretty much like the flagship country in Africa in terms of Pan-Africanism, especially in terms of embracing those of us who, the descendants of the enslaved. So I would say that's something that we can learn. All the resistance, the Ashanti Kingdom. Someone, you said Tanzania, Namibia. I mean, Namibia, they went through unfortunately, Namibia, the Germans did what they did to the Namibians before they ever did what they did to the Jews in Europe, to the Herero people. And so we can learn from that. I mean, the Namibia has some of the oldest human beings on the planet, the Khoisan people who have some of the most distinct genetic DNA in the world. So there's so many things we can learn for human origins from Namibia. I mean, you can name an African country. There's so much.
Yeah, and I would say even Ghana, it wasn't, constricted to the current country of Ghana, right? There was the ancient empire of Ghana, which later became the ancient empire of Mali and then Songhai. And then when those empires fell, that's when the Europeans came in 14 something and then brought over African people as slaves. So there's also that part of changing the narrative of saying that they took slaves from Africa. They didn't take slaves from Africa. They took teachers, they took children, they took scientists, they took astrologists, astronomers that were part of that empire of Songhai that fell. So they didn't just take anybody, they took intellectuals and put them into indentured slavery, which they could really be seen as, prisoners of war. That's how I see it. But they didn't just take anybody.
I did just want to add, I mean, like essentially 100% with what you have both said. You can go anywhere in Africa on the continent and you can engage and learn so much that will be applicable to just how you move and how you engage with reality. But I do just want to highlight one of the reasons why the Nile River Valley is uplifted so much is because of the timeline that we were talking about in that placement, in addition to the fact the Nile River Valley has been historically the leading arm of the entire African civilization. So when you're kind of talking about necessarily power projection and engaging with like the rest of the world, that came from Nile River Valley primarily. And so I think when we want to see ourselves at kind of our apex point, that is kind of where we point to, because that is where some of those engagements, at least how we frame it today, occurred.
And engagements, not just in Africa, but with the rest of the world, right? Everybody looked towards ancient Kemet, ancient Egypt at the time. Like Hippocrates, who is quote unquote the father of medicine, said that he worshipped at the feet of Imhotep, which was one of the first polymaths of ancient Kemet. And he was revered as the god of medicine in Greece, and he was called Asclepius. So it's not just that we're taking ancient Egypt out of nowhere. It's because it is the epitome of what, the beginning of the civilizations that we have today.
Thank you for that. To add on to their question, can anyone speak on ancient civilizations, maybe in West Africa or South Africa, like maybe the Nox civilization or anything like that?
Yeah, so the Nox civilization was in Nigeria, and I think that we do, in the documentary, I do show a few images of that. And there was also the ancient empires, Great Zimbabwe, Mapungubwe in Southern Africa. And, when we were talking about ancient civilizations, the bone of Ishango is the first ever evidence of mathematics done by a human being. And that was found in Southern Africa. So these places, they're not just the whole of Africa. There were amazing inventions and creativity and things that came out of there to give us the civilizations that we have today. And even, within Cameroon, where I'm from, the Mamileke regions and, the Bamoun kingdoms and Kanem-Borno in the northern of Africa. So we can go on and on about ancient kingdoms and empires. They all existed. And they were all, great in their own different ways.
Thank you so much. Okay, we have another question from Satorian Lambda. This one says, I would like the answer to the question, why don't we trust each other? Blacks can do a lot by themselves, but not so good together? Question mark. This happens both in Africa and its diaspora. You guys already kind of touched on that, but I guess they want a more elaborate answer.
I would say you should question your assumption of why you have it. You say, why don't we trust each other? Well, some of us do trust each other, first of all. So it's not like we don't trust each other. But for those of us who don't, and the trust issues that do exist that we know of, I won't dismiss your question in that way, but I just want you to think about it. You don't necessarily have to frame it in that type of a way. But we have a lot of reason not to trust each other, in a sense, because we turn our back on each other. We sold each other out. You know what I mean? You got to look at it like this. Before this Ma'afa, this great disaster coming on by the Europeans, the transatlantic slave trade, all of the things that we went through, we didn't have a unified understanding of who we are as one Black people or one African people or one melanated people.
We didn't need to at the time.
We didn't
have that notion of racism.
Yeah, we didn't have a concept of that. And so so what happened was we had our own local rivals. I like to say rivals. I don't just say, that we were enemies within each other, but I look at it as rivals. You have competing interests and you have conflict within the region. The Europeans came and they offered an advantage. They could offer one group may align with the Portuguese and another African group may align with the Dutch. Because we didn't view ourselves as one group, we didn't realize that, we were being played, that the Portuguese and the Dutch, eventually they were just going to, consolidate together at our expense. I mean, a perfect example is South Africa. I mean, you have the Boer Wars with the British. And eventually they were fighting each other so much, they're like, you know what, we're just going to create this system. We're going to stop fighting each other. And we're going to create this system called apartheid. And then we'll just have all white people, will benefit. So you look at the United States, first they didn't used to let Catholics in. I mean, Italians had a rough time. Irish had a rough time. But eventually they consolidated under this umbrella of whiteness against us. So I would say it's by design. It's by design that we don't trust each other. We do have reason, because the thing about it is, as long as we have this power dynamic where Europeans have the resource, we're essentially vying for approval or acceptance by Europeans for our money, for our well-being and our livelihood, we're going to compete against each other to get that. And so a lot of people, this is an issue that people talk about, they're competing for the one job that Europeans created, and they view their brother as, they may view, African immigrant, an African American may view an African immigrant as a competitor for that job that's created by white folks. So instead of saying, oh, here I have someone here, this is more human capital, let's the two of us come together and see if we can create something to employ our people.
I was going to just add to that as well. I think what you said in terms of it's intentional, and this was something that was by design. That's like 100% correct. Not only that, but the propaganda that we receive about ourselves, the social engineering that we receive, is all part of a systematic push to create internal division amongst ourselves, too. So I think when we talk about not being able to trust each other, we also have to also pay attention to what were the structures that we had in place before that allowed us to trust each other. I mean, we essentially had family loyalty and trust-based structures that we were all a part of. But when the colonial and enslavement process happened, all of those were disrupted. So like now, a perfect example, if you lived in a continental African society, and the way that you engaged in the society was primarily maintained and developed by your family unit that you lived with, but all of a sudden now you're in a colonial system where you're now relying on a colonial state, that's a completely different type of engagement. And I think that there's still kind of what you're saying, the resources are no longer in a place where we have the complete ability of having, I don't want to necessarily say that, but having the complete ability of managing them ourselves, that we can make sure that we are all taken care of in a way where that loyalty and trust can be guaranteed to be there.
Okay. Michaela, do we have any more questions?
We do. We're gonna run a little longer than planned since we started about 10 minutes late, so we can take a couple more questions before we close out. So this next question is from Junior, and it's a great question for this panelist of institution builders and teachers. They ask, what can we do to share this real information about our origins and culture to our present and future generations, like books from Sheikh Anta Diop and many others? New school, new institutions. Was that question clear? They're basically asking, what can we do to further this information?
Well, I think the first thing that we must begin to do, particularly as adults and even parents, understanding the role that parents play in educating their children before the child even goes to pre-K or kindergarten. There are many individuals who have the wherewithal to know that they begin educating their child when they're still in the womb. When the child is still in the womb, they can hear, they can feel that energy. But just on a basic level, education begins in the home. And so unfortunately, a lot of parents don't have the information that they need to teach to the young people. So we can't expect the young people to teach it if the adults don't know it. And it is, I think, pretty clear for many of our people that we cannot necessarily depend on the school system to teach our children this information. And so while there are many ways to address this issue, whether it's being more proactive and involved in the school system, being a part of PTA meetings, having meetings with the principals and educators to say, hey, this information is out there. I noticed that it's not a part of the curriculum. What can we do to bring this information into the classroom? And I can guarantee you that the more parents that stepped up and began to have those types of conversations with administrators and school teachers, then we'll see some change. But until that point, I think at least the parents can begin working with young people at home, putting them in after school programs or cultural programs that are available, because there's a number of them out there, but finding the resources and finding the programs to do just that. And so we have to start somewhere. But of course, we have to begin with the basics, which is just reading. So can you imagine if every single African-American child and their parent in this entire country started with just one book, and they read that book together, or maybe the parent read that book first, and then during dinner time or at breakfast or on the ride home from school, engaging the children in conversations about certain topics. So I think it's really just a matter of creating that space. So if it's not going to be in the school system, if it's not going to be in the churches, then we can surely start at home. And that is something that we all have control over.
And I think that, I can speak from my own personal experience, and Atlantis also, our parents, they valued these things, even our names, my name is Kamau because my family valued, giving their children an African name. And so we don't have to be from Kenya to have a Kenyan name. You're not from England and you have a British name, but you didn't question it, So that's something that we can start with. You can name your children. Having a name, you grew up with that name, and so it's the earliest thing that you know. So if you have a child, you can name that child a name that comes from Africa that has a meaning. My name means silent warrior, and then my dad always told me that's who I was, a quiet warrior. And then Malik means king or chief. It's Arabic, but it's so basically my dad always told me coming up, you're a silent warrior who will one day be a king. So it's like these are the type of things you could plant a seed in your children's mind at an early age, and they'll think about it. Like, wow, this is significance. My life is greater than just waking up every day. So I think it's with those things. Also aesthetics. I mean, the visuals. The way you design your home, the way you decorate your house. I mean, so you don't have to wear so-called African clothes to be African, but the thing is, these small things like the music, the food, the dress, the pouring libation every day or so, or just doing different practices, these things start to seep in. So I think some of the things that we can do is, one, we have to do our research. I guarantee you there's way more resources out there that you don't know of. What happens is most people this is the saddest thing to me. We're all like feel like we have to recreate the wheel. We don't have a strong cultural continuity between one generation to the next. So how many times have you yourself, the viewers, us watching, how many people do you know who have this exact story if they said, okay, now I'm grown. I feel like I've been lied to my whole life. Now I have to relearn everything. But why is everyone having this epiphany on their own? It's like we're all going through it on our own. And then that's once you start to thoroughly seek, you start to find places like Sankofa. You'll find places like,
The book club.
like, Talking Drum Book Club. And then you'll meet one person to a next and you realize, whoa, I didn't know they had a Pan-African bookstore in Pittsburgh. You know what I'm saying? Or I didn't know that there was some Black homeschool collective that was operating and that you could tap into from Toronto. These things exist, but the thing is, we're up against the mass media. We're doing our best to get the word out there, but Sankofa's got 11,000 people on Instagram. I mean, that's a lot for us, but I mean, you got people in there with 11 million. So we gotta somehow get a hold of the things that we do. We have to amplify their reach. There's so many great things going on. So if we can continue to support institutions and amplify their reach, I think that's the key. Find the people, the small people doing the work, and just amplify their capacity to do more. Because they're out there for sure.
Thank you for the question.
Fantastic. That was a great answer. And it sounded like Atlantis and Kamau were echoing each other, and basically it starts at home. It starts with you getting involved and doing your own research, finding information. That was the last question, but we do have some comments of agreements. And Yola says, yes, reading books and articles about our glorious history and sharing with our family and friends does work. Sharing information and the culture does help, exclamation mark. So it's very positive. So I don't know if you all wanted to have some closing remarks, and perhaps someone in the audience will ask one last question while that happens.
Right. I think I did have one more question that I wanted to ask the panel, and that came by the end of the documentary, and I brought about this concept of the African organizing, the evolutionary process that every state people lives in, goes through. So what would continental unity in this evolutionary process have looked like today had it been left uninterrupted? So that's basically your personal opinions, and what is your ideal, what does this unity look like to you? And when we say unity, the podcast is called Umoja Sessions, which means unity sessions. So hence the ending.
Well, I mean, just on a basic level, the first image that came to my mind is Wakanda. Even though it's a mythological,
everybody says Wakanda.
No, seriously. I mean, even though it's a mythological place, when you are familiar with African history and culture, East and West, North and South, you recognize those elements in Wakanda. So even though it's not a real place, it's definitely built off of
the stories based on truth. Yes.
Culture.
Yeah, what I would say, before I answer the question, I just want to touch on two things. It's good to study our glory. The comment was made about studying the glorious history. It is good, but we have to study the losses as well. We got to study where we went wrong. I don't want anyone to walk away from this conversation thinking that Black people and African people are perfect and that European and white people are the embodiment of evil. Because we're human frailty and weakness and temptation can impact anyone. You know what I'm saying? So I just want to put that out there. Now, in terms of the unity, so the question is what I think it would look like if it was uninterrupted. Personally, I think it may have taken a long time for us to become unified as a people without the interruption, because we didn't necessarily have an incentive to. We didn't necessarily.
Is there a need for
racial?
now?
The racial identity. I do think there's a need for it now. But yeah, the racial identity, we didn't have the same concept of race. Things was really specific to our family, our clan, our tribe, and it went out from those type of concentric circles. And so language is very, very important. I mean, it was very difficult necessarily for us to see ourselves as the same people if we didn't speak the same language. Even though we look alike, if we don't have a means for communication, it's going to be very difficult for us to have a common identity. Our common experience of being assaulted by Europeans has helped us to formulate some sort of a common identity. It's just the reality that it is. So I do think that, so in terms of the unity, I might have taken a long time before the interruption. But right now, my vision and what I see is, I look at it from the micro level and the macro level. Because some people, I think some of our ideas are too big. Look at yourself in the mirror. What are you going to do on a daily basis? How can you foster unity in your own life? Can you reach out to someone of a different background, another Black person, another person of African descent from a different cultural background? Can you study their history, learn their language? That's one of the things that I've been doing is I studied Amharic. Earlier you had said Arabic, and I've been waiting to correct it to the end. But yeah, I studied Amharic, which is a language of Ethiopia, and it's allowed me to connect to a community and connect to a culture and a people in a way that I wouldn't had I not. I hear people have. I would challenge all of us to learn something about, if you're African American, try to learn something about Jamaican history. If you're Jamaican, try to learn something about Nigerian history. So on. If you're Igbo, learn about Yoruba. So always, and I think those type of things will help.
Now, can you emphasize again why it's even necessary for a Nigerian to know more about Cameroonian history or vice versa?
Well, these borders are not real. These borders, they are real in the sense of they're political, and they stand on some sort of authority, but they've come from the colonial experience. I mean, you have some of the same people living on both sides of the border. Plus, at the same, it's going to enrich you. I mean, culture is dynamic, and so even you have some Afrobeat singers from Nigeria using Swahili. I mean, these things are very good. It's going to help us to be a unified block. I mean, right now, when you have a little country like Equatorial Guinea, and you have countries like Seychelles and these smaller countries, and they're doing deals with China and the U.S. and Russia and these behemoths of countries, they're very marginal, and they can kind of pit these regions against each other. If we come together as a block, as one political block, economic block, we have some, we'll be more respected, I believe. I think that we'll be able to enact our will, as opposed to just having to go with whatever, like, the Americans are acting up, so let me go to the Chinese. The Chinese are acting up, so let me go to the Russians. And it's like, all right, well, are you going to run? When can we run to ourselves? Do we believe in ourselves?
You mean each other?
Do we believe in each other? When I say, I guess when I say ourselves, I mean each other, the collective, our,
okay,
ourselves.
I'd like to add something to the question as well. So I guess with regards to the continuation of unity being interrupted, so I would say two things. I would say, number one, it was happening, and number two, it's still continuing to happen right now. So even before, when we look at ancient Africa, there were multiple empires that we touched on in West Africa, East Africa, that were multi-tribal or multi-ethnic group in nature, and they were expanding and bringing more people into that as a view. So I think that is one thing that we have to understand, is that the unity of ourselves and the unity of our civilization has always kind of been the trajectory in one form or another. Now, when I think about what that actually looks like, you touched on it, Kamau, in saying the way that we had arranged ourselves was basically on our immediate extensions of ourselves. So we had, our immediate family, which then translated into our immediate clan, which then translated into our immediate tribe, and then maybe a collection of tribes will now equal a kingdom, and a collection of kingdoms will now equal an empire. And I still think that is a thought process that is there, and is something to be said for that. Now, the vision, when we talk about what this looks like in terms of global Black unity, not just the continent being unified, and I think that's something that we have to be very specific about, that it's not about the unification of a geographical landmass, but it's about the unification of Black people wherever they are at. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes we get lost in that combo, but for me, it looks borderless. You know, in the same way how Marcus Garvey had envisioned for the UNIA to be a provisional government of all African and Black people wherever they are at. So whether you are in Australia, whether you are in Jamaica, whether you are anywhere, our nation, our civilization is now fully integrated. We have access to it at any time. So whatever Afrofuturistic ways we want to envision that, you know, let's go ahead and take it to the max. But I think we have to understand that everybody's already part of our civilization, and we should kind of act like it in the way in which we kind of are going about towards this unification process, especially with the technology that we now have access to. There's no reason for us to not be more connected with each other with the tools that we have access to now in the modern day.
Mm. That was amazing closing arguments, guys. So I guess I'm gonna really close out by talking, taking 2 minutes to talk about the reason for this documentary. I think that I was telling you guys earlier that when I moved to the United States, there was this narrative, this story of the African that was told to me and was basically not what I had lived. It wasn't my reality. And I feared that if I, continued living in the way that I was living, I would embrace that false reality. And I didn't want that to happen. And I basically didn't want, and I don't want to hear any more of those, derogatory comments and questions when we really have the internet now, right? So, and so it goes back to this quote that Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, I just butchered her name, said in one of her TED Talks. It's called The Danger of a Single Story. She said, "If this is all I hear about you, then that is all I know about you." So basically, when you don't have various perspectives of voices and you only hear a single story about a person or people or a place, that's the only narrative that you know about them. And that narrative then consumes you. And any other effort of trying to understand that person is overwhelmed by that perspective that you have of them. So this documentary was really to change the perspective, to change this idea that we have when we think about African folk, Black folk, Afro descendants, to really show you who you are, who you were, and who you can be, right? We were talking about a timeline, and we were talking about how to reach that continental unity. And it's really about being able to take a step back and understand the process and the cycles of history, right? History repeats itself. So if you want to know about the future, you need to learn about the past. And so when you begin to learn about that repetition, then you'll understand more about who you are. And instead of hating who you are and hating your kin, instead you'll love yourself and for who you are, and you'll get to know yourself, and you'll want to know more about yourself. So I think that's the message that I wanted to give in this documentary. And I think Black History Month was the perfect time to showcase this. I guess the world is way more receptive about these type of things at this time of the year. So that was my closing argument, quote unquote, message. So thank you all for participating in this panel. Thank you, Atlantis. Thank you, Miles. Thank you, Kamau. And thank you, Michaela, for making this happen. And thank you all to all the viewers on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and everybody else in this room. I hope you learned a lot, and I hope that you'll take that knowledge with you and do something productive with it.
You're muted. You're muted.
Thank you. I was just saying thank you so much, and I don't need to add anything more to that. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you also to the audience. And you can find more at amazinglyafrica.com. And if you want to find more information about the book that the documentary was written, that it was influenced by Shaken to Joke's book, you can find out more at sankofa.com. So we hope to see you at the next event, and everyone have a great and a safe night.
Thank you.
Yes, very nice.